This morning, we will be talking about a new UU principle, the eighth UU principle. And to tell us more about that, I'd like to invite Jeanette Rule and Kay Bennett to come forward for our first reading.
Today's reading is adapted from the Eighth Principle UU.org website. This is the proposed eighth principle. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions.
Where did the eighth principle come from? Paula Cole Jones, a Unitarian Universalist lay leader, consultant, and Black woman from All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C., is a longtime anti-racism, anti-oppression activist. After working with congregations on the 7 UU principles and the concept of beloved community for over 15 years, she realized that a person can believe they are being a good UU and follow the 7 principles without thinking about or dealing with racism and other oppressions at the systemic level, or thinking about what beloved community really means. Paula realized that an eighth principle was needed to correct this. And on this, she worked with Reverend Bruce Pollock Johnson, minister of the UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia, along with a group of anti-racist activists. Ultimately, Bruce's congregation incorporated the eighth principle into their covenant in May 2017. Paula and Bruce then recommended that the UUA adopt it at a future General Assembly. In the meantime, individual congregations have been learning about the eighth principle and adopting it into their own covenants.
Why single out racism? The UUA has done well with women becoming ministers and leaders. The 7 principles themselves came out of the women's movement within UUism. The LGBTQIA community is well represented as members, ministers, RE staff, and other leadership in individual congregations and the UUA. The Welcoming Congregation program has been very effective. There has also been good progress with people who are differently abled. But in the United States, racism stands out.
Why the UUA? Historically, Unitarians were largely from the New England European American elite. They often did not treat Native American peoples well. They benefited from slavery, and some were leaders in the eugenics movement. Some Unitarian and Universalist ministers spoke out against slavery, but the denomination did little. Much later on, UUs did a very good job during the civil rights movement, largely at the request of Dr. King. In the late 1960s, a promising movement of Black UUs was supported by the UUA, but then defunded because of a financial crisis, leading to a terrible conflict after which many African Americans left the UUA. There was a long period of silence until the late 1980s and early 90s, with excellent progress after that for a decade or so. But we have regressed, leading to a UUA president resigning over hiring inclusivity issues in 2017.
Why an eighth principle? Among numerous reasons, the UU principles were designed to be dynamic, not a fixed creed. It means we need to continue to educate ourselves, exploring truth and raising our consciousness. When we achieve a new level of understanding and clarity, our structure makes it possible to reflect that. UUism is the only religion that intentionally builds in that flexibility to acknowledge the importance of ongoing revealed truth. This happened when environmental awareness reached a critical mass and was added as a seventh principle. We are approaching a similar critical mass level of awareness with the systemic nature of racism and other oppressions. None of the other principles mention love. By having beloved community stated in the eighth principle, it brings our commitment to love higher in our consciousness. For people identified as white, it is too easy to ignore these issues, which keeps the system of racism in our society alive. We need to decenter whiteness and other dominant cultures in UUism. Here ends the reading.
Well, I'd like to extend a thank you to Jeanette, Kay, and Thea for helping to put this service together and educate us about this new proposed 8th UU principle. a principle that states, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." You might wonder, why must we as a faith adopt a principle that talks explicitly about dismantling racism and building a diverse, multicultural, beloved community? Why? Because we as a faith have much work to do in this area. For we have a serious problem in this country and in our faith, and yes, even in this congregation, a problem with the old and very ugly issue of racism. You know, it rears its nasty little reptilian head in many ways and in many places and in many circumstances. You know, shockingly, it even rears its little head in me sometimes. Perhaps it does in you as well. You know, racism is so old, it predates written history. You know, imagine groups of hunter-gatherers encountering strangers and feeling threatened by the way those strangers looked and why they acted so differently. Human beings become imprinted early on in our lives. It takes a great deal of education, of training, and intellectual capacity to overcome the natural inclination to fear the stranger. You know, it's a sign of advanced civilization when people are able to extend benefits of kinship to the stranger, to break bread together, to offer shelter and clothing. And you know, we've come a long way as a species in doing just that. We have not yet overcome our inherent wariness when confronted with a stranger, especially the stranger of a different color. You know, of course, when we get to know the people who seem so different, we find out that we are much more alike than different. We begin to care about them as we care about our families and our friends. We begin to see them as friends and even family. You know, this is what happened to certain churchmen in Latin America who became dismayed and disgusted by the way the established Roman Catholic Church cooperated with and benefited from growing business and industry to the detriment of the local people throughout Central and South America. These churchmen developed what is now known as liberation theology. And while we as Unitarian Universalists who have an open and welcoming theology, something far from the strict tenets of Catholicism, we must remember that Christianity is part of our past. It's part of what makes us who we are today. In fact, until quite recently, both Unitarians and Universalists considered themselves to be Christian. Sure, today most of us do not consider ourselves to be Christian at all. Some of us would like nothing more than to reject the entirety of our Christian past. You know, but part of our UU faith is rooted in Christian ideals, honoring the inherent worth and dignity in everyone, in advocating for the oppressed, in searching for that beloved community where the poor, the hungry, and the forgotten are welcomed with open arms. That is core to Christian liberation theology. Simply put, liberation theology is a movement that attempts to interpret Scripture through the plight of the poor. True followers of Jesus, according to liberation theology, must work toward a just society, to bring about social and political change, to align themselves with the working class. Jesus, who was in fact poor himself, focused on the poor and the downtrodden. Any legitimate church will give preference to those who have historically been marginalized or deprived of their basic rights. All church doctrine should grow out of the perspective of the poor. Defending the rights of the poor is seen as the central aspect of the gospel. In the 1987 book, Introducing Liberation Theology by Leonardo and Claude Visboff, we read that the roots of liberation theology run deep into the soil of the prophetic tradition of evangelists and missionaries from the earliest colonial days in Latin America. Churchmen who questioned the place the church took for itself in communities and the way indigenous people, black people, mestizos, and the poor rural and urban masses were treated. Starting in the 1960s, a great wind of renewal blew throughout the churches. They began to take their social mission seriously. Laypersons committed themselves to work among the poor. Charismatic bishops and priests encouraged the calls for progress and national modernization. Various church organizations promoted understanding of and improvements in the living conditions of the people. A Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote one of the movement's most famous books, A Theology of Liberation, coined the term liberation theology in 1971. Since then, liberation theology has grown into an international and interdenominational movement. The late Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero has long been recognized as the unofficial saint of liberation theology. Romero took up the cause of the poor in El Salvador. God needs the people themselves, he said, to save the world. The world of the poor teaches us that liberation will arrive only when the poor are not simply on the receiving end of handouts from governments or from churches, but when they themselves are the masters and protagonists of their own struggle for liberation. The influence of Latin American theology diminished after the Vatican Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, the CDF, accused proponents of using, quote, Marxist concepts, leading to admonishments in 1984 and in 1986. See, the Vatican criticized strains of Latin American liberation theology for focusing on institutionalized or systemic sin, apparently to the exclusion of individual offenders and offenses, and for identifying Catholic Church hierarchy in South America as members of the same privileged class that had long been oppressing indigenous populations since the arrival of Pizarro and onward. The movement illuminated the divide between the conservative and the liberal wings of the Catholic Church. Conservatives were unhappy with the focus on the poor, and liberals were unhappy with the protection of the rich. The theology is most accurately encapsulated in this paragraph from Leonardo and Claude Visboff. Question: how are we to be Christians in a world of destitution and injustice? Answer: there can only be one answer. We can be followers of Jesus and true Christians only by making common cause with the poor and working out the gospel of liberation. Liberation theology said the church should derive its legitimacy and theology by growing out of the poor. The Bible should be read and experienced from the perspective of the poor. The church should be a movement for those who were denied their rights and plunged into such poverty that they were deprived of their full status as human beings. The poor should take the example of Jesus and use it to bring about a just society. Most controversially, the liberationists said the church should act to bring about social change and should ally itself with the working class to do so. Some radical priests became involved in politics and trade unions. Others even aligned themselves with violent revolutionary movements. A common way in which priests and nuns showed their solidarity with the poor was to move from religious houses into poverty-stricken areas to share the living conditions of their flocks. As with many movements, liberation theology waxes and wanes depending on circumstances. But, in concurrent with the Black Lives Matter movement, two events brought back my thoughts to liberation theology. A few years ago, Pope Francis told reporters he wanted the beatification of Oscar Romero to be done quickly. Romero is a man of God, Francis said, and the process must move now. Well, Pope Francis's signal that the late Salvadoran Archbishop now has a legitimate path to sainthood is the latest in a series of statements to trigger media speculation that he seeks to build a better, a more harmonious relationship with the liberation movement. It seems this Pope is moving the Church toward a greater awareness of the plight of the world's poor and marginalized, perhaps as part of a broader sweep of reform. Pope Francis has stirred the pot with some of his decisions and pronouncements. And while I realize a good many people who now identify as Unitarian Universalist have come to us out of a place of heartache and woundedness from their time in the Roman Catholic Church, I think it's a good thing to pay attention to what any current pope is saying, for it affects a lot of people, many of whom are our friends. It can also affect public policy, about which many Unitarian Universalists are concerned. You know, it might be very important in our lifetime if the Catholic Church becomes more closely aligned with the liberation theology movement. There is increasing interest in reforming economic and judicial systems to more fairly treat marginalized populations in this country. You know, the second event that brought the thought of liberation theology to mind happened when the UUA joined with the United Church of Christ in recommitting to the sanctuary movement. The sanctuary movement was a religious and political campaign in the United States that began in the early 1980s to provide safe haven for Central American refugees fleeing civil conflict. It responded to the very restrictive United States federal immigration policies that made obtaining asylum difficult for Central Americans. At its peak, Sanctuary involved over 500 congregations across the country that, by declaring themselves official sanctuaries, committed to providing shelter, material goods, and often legal advice to Central American refugees. Movement members acted in open defiance of federal law, and many prominent sanctuary figures were arrested and put on trial in the late 1980s. The sanctuary movement had its roots in liberation theology. Even those humanists who didn't identify as Christian agreed with the basic tenets that a moral life involves advocating for the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised people of a society. The recommitment to that movement is focused on protecting immigrant families here in the United States from unjust deportation. You know, we may not be ready to open our doors to those who face unjust deportation, but it would be good if we could. We may not be ready to go into the places where the people live in poverty and despair, but it would be good if we could. It would be so good if we had the kind of courage and commitment, and some of us do, to align ourselves with the poor, the historically marginalized, the folks who, let's be honest, scare us. It would be good if we could reframe our thinking to move outward from ourselves into the world of the hungry, the thirsty, the homeless, the prisoner, those who have been and continue to be systematically oppressed. Now, there's a song by Bernice Johnson Reagan that goes, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes, until the killing of black men, of black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, of white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest." It would be good if we could reimagine what our lives could be like when all of us are liberated from the structures in our culture that oppress millions and millions of people. For injustice anywhere, said Dr. King, is a threat to justice everywhere. It would be good if we were to bear in mind always that our own liberation is bound up in the liberation of all people from oppressive systems and structures everywhere. That is why we must begin by adopting an 8th UU principle, something that goes to the heart of who we are as a faith, a principle that encourages us to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community that accountably dismantles racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. For right now, we are only one of many UU congregations all over the world who are talking about this new 8th principle and wrestling with the ways that we can work to dismantle racism within ourselves and within our world. In fact, we as a congregation will in fact be voting in the spring of 2022, along with every other UU congregation, as to whether we agree that we as a faith should adopt this new principle. Then, based on the votes of UU congregations all over the world, during the UU General Assembly of 2022, the 8th UU principle will either be adopted or rejected. But right now, this is a conversation that starts with you, with me, with us, coming to terms with something that is all too often swept under the rug. Often the structures of systemic oppression and racism seem so big that we wonder what we as individuals can really do about it. But as Helen Keller once said, "I'm only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can." So friends, if you believe in freedom and the liberation of all people, you cannot rest until it comes for everyone. If you believe that we must work to build that beloved community where all are welcome at the table, then you can do something. Each of us can do something. So I ask you to find the something that you can do and go out and do it. Amen.